The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the government-issued transport vehicle. Her boots hit the asphalt with purpose, but inside her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. 26 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she looked like any other new recruit arriving for basic training. What nobody knew was the storm of determination brewing beneath her calm exterior. Sarah had always been different from other girls in her small Texas hometown. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or dating local boys, she was in the woods with her grandfather, learning to track deer, start fires without matches, and survive on nothing but her wits and whatever nature provided. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran, had seen something special in her from the age of 12 when she'd spent 3 days lost in the wilderness during a family camping trip and emerged stronger, not weaker. Most people break when they're tested, he'd told her once, watching her practice knife throwing behind their house. But you, Sarah, you bend and then snap back harder than before. Those words echoed in her mind now as she approached the imposing concrete buildings that would become her world for the next several months. She'd already completed 4 years in the regular Navy, serving aboard destroyers and learning everything she could about naval operations, weapons systems, and combat tactics. But this was different. This was the dream she'd harbored since she was 18 years old. Watching a documentary about Navy SEALs and knowing with absolute certainty that this was her calling. The problem was, not everyone agreed. "Next!" barked a voice from behind a metal desk set up outside the main building. Sarah approached, her paperwork clutched in her hand. The petty officer behind the desk looked up, did a double take, then frowned as if someone had played an elaborate practical joke on him. "You lost, sailor?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, petty officer. Sarah Martinez reporting for Bud S. training, Class 347. She handed over her orders, keeping her voice steady and professional. The man took the papers, squinted at them like they were written in a foreign language, then looked back at her. "There must be some mistake. This is Navy SEAL training, not some summer camp for wannabes." Sarah felt the familiar fire start to burn in her belly, but she kept her expression neutral. "No mistake, petty officer. My orders are correct." A small crowd of other new recruits had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others openly skeptical. A few snickered and whispered among themselves. She'd expected this reaction, had prepared for it, but experiencing it firsthand still stung. "Well, I'll be damned," the petty officer muttered, shaking his head. He stamped her papers with more force than necessary. "Good luck, princess. You're gonna need it." As Sarah walked toward the barracks, she caught snippets of conversation from the other recruits following behind her. "Did you see that? A girl thinks she can be a SEAL. My money says she quits before the first week is over. Hell, I give her 3 days max." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn around. She'd heard worse during her time in the regular Navy, where she'd had to prove herself over and over again just to be taken seriously. The difference was, here the stakes were higher. Here, failure meant watching her lifelong dream crumble to dust. The barracks were exactly what she'd expected. Stark, utilitarian, with rows of metal bunk beds and lockers. She found her assigned rack and began unpacking her gear with military precision. Around her, other recruits were doing the same, but the conversations died whenever she was within earshot. She was an anomaly, a disruption to their assumptions about who belonged in this sacred brotherhood. "You really think you can hack it here?" Sarah looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered recruit standing beside her bunk. He had the kind of build that suggested he'd played football in college, all muscle and swagger. His name tape read, Johnson. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't," Sarah replied, continuing to organize her gear. Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Look, sweetheart, I'm sure you're tough for a girl and all, but this isn't the regular Navy. This is the real deal. Guys like me have been training our whole lives for this. You're just going to get hurt. Sarah straightened up and met his gaze directly. My name is Martinez, not sweetheart. And I appreciate your concern, but I can take care of myself. We'll see about that, Johnson said, his voice dropping lower. Just don't expect us to carry you when you can't keep up. Before Sarah could respond, a voice boomed through the barracks like thunder. Drop and give me 50! All of you! Now! The voice belonged to Instructor Chief Petty Officer Rick Hoffman, a man whose reputation preceded him like a hurricane warning. Tall, lean, with eyes that could cut through steel and a voice that could wake the dead, Hoffman had been training SEAL candidates for over 15 years. He'd seen every type of recruit imaginable. The cocky college athletes, the quiet professionals, the adrenaline junkies, and the wannabe heroes. But as his gaze swept across the barracks and landed on Sarah Martinez, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Every recruit in the barracks dropped to the ground and began cranking out push-ups. Sarah's form was textbook perfect. Her back straight, her movements controlled and precise. She'd been doing push-ups since she was 12 years old, and her form showed it. 47, 48, 49, 50, Hoffman counted out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. On your feet! The recruits scrambled to attention, some breathing harder than others. Hoffman began walking slowly between the rows, his predatory gaze assessing each candidate like a shark evaluating potential prey. Welcome to Bud S, ladies, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. For the next 6 months, your life belongs to me and my fellow instructors. Some of you think you're tough. Some of you think you're special. Some of you probably think you're God's gift to the United States Navy. His eyes landed on Sarah, and she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. But here's the truth. 90% of you will quit before you graduate. You'll ring that bell over there. He pointed to a brass bell mounted near the entrance. And you'll walk away from the hardest thing you've ever attempted in your miserable lives. He stopped directly in front of Sarah, so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. And some of you, he said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears, don't belong here at all. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect, her breathing controlled. She'd known this moment would come, had rehearsed her response 1,000 times. But hearing the dismissal in his voice, seeing the doubt in his eyes, still cut deeper than she'd expected. Today, we start with a little warm-up, Hoffman announced, stepping back to address the entire group. A 4-mile run along the beach. Nothing too strenuous for our elite warriors. His smile was predatory. Fall out in PT gear. You have 5 minutes. The barracks exploded into motion as recruits scrambled to change into their physical training uniforms. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, pulling on her shorts and t-shirt while trying to ignore the pointed looks and whispered comments around her. Martinez, Johnson's voice cut through the noise. She looked over to see him lacing up his running shoes, that same smirk on his face. Try to keep up, princess. Sarah finished tying her own shoes and stood up. Don't worry about me, Johnson. Worry about yourself. The recruits formed up outside the barracks in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before them, its surface black and restless under the star-lit sky. Hoffman appeared at the front of the formation, flanked by 2 other instructors whose expressions suggested they ate recruits for breakfast. This is a timed run, Hoffman announced. 32 minutes or less, or you get to do it again, and again, and again until you get it right or until you quit. He paused, letting the words sink in. Move out. The formation began to move, feet pounding in rhythm against the sand. Sarah found herself in the middle of the pack, which was exactly where she wanted to be. Too far forward, and she'd be accused of showing off. Too far back, and she'd be labeled a quitter. She settled into her pace, her breathing controlled and steady. The beach stretched out before them like an endless ribbon of sand and obstacles. The soft sand made every step an effort, sapping energy from leg muscles and testing cardiovascular endurance. Around her, she could hear other recruits beginning to struggle, their breathing becoming labored, their pace starting to falter. "Come on, Martinez!" Johnson's voice came from somewhere behind her. "Don't tell me you're already getting tired." Sarah didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that the best response to taunts was performance. Let her actions speak louder than her words. She increased her pace slightly, pulling ahead of a group of recruits who were already beginning to fall behind. By the 2-mile mark, the formation had started to spread out. The faster runners had pulled ahead, while others began to struggle with the demanding pace and the soft sand footing. Sarah found herself in the front third of the group, her breathing still controlled, her stride still strong. "Looking good, Martinez," came a voice from beside her. She glanced over to see another recruit keeping pace with her, a lean, wiry man whose name tape read Torres. Unlike Johnson, Torres's comment seemed genuine, without any underlying mockery. "Thanks," Sarah replied, not wanting to waste energy on conversation but appreciating the encouragement. "Don't let the idiots get to you," Torres said quietly. "Half these guys will be gone by week 3 anyway." Sarah nodded, saving her breath for the run. She could see the turnaround point ahead, marked by an instructor with a stopwatch. As they approached, she could hear him calling out times to the front runners. 14:30, 15:15, 15:40. Sarah and Torres hit the turnaround point at just over 16 minutes, well ahead of pace for the required 32-minute completion time. As they started back toward the starting point, Sarah could see the rest of the formation strung out behind them. Some recruits were already in serious trouble, their faces red with exertion, their pace slowing to little more than a jog. The return trip was always harder. The initial adrenaline had worn off, muscles were beginning to fatigue, and the psychological challenge of retracing their steps tested mental toughness as much as physical endurance. Sarah had run thousands of miles during her Navy career, including many in far worse conditions than this morning's cool, overcast weather. She found her rhythm again and settled in for the long haul. "Hey, Martinez!" Johnson's voice came from somewhere behind her again, but this time it sounded strained. "Where are you going? Trying to show off for the instructors?" Sarah glanced back and saw Johnson struggling to keep up, his face flushed and his breathing labored. The cocky swagger from earlier was nowhere to be seen. She faced forward again and increased her pace slightly, opening up more distance between them. "Damn girl can run," she heard Torres mutter beside her. And despite the situation, Sarah felt a small surge of satisfaction. With a mile to go, Sarah was still feeling strong. Her grandfather's training in the Texas wilderness had built a foundation of endurance that 4 years in the Navy had only strengthened. She'd spent countless hours running on beaches, in forests, through deserts, and in every conceivable weather condition. This morning's run, challenging as it was designed to be, was within her capabilities. The finish line came into view, marked by Instructor Hoffman standing with his ever-present clipboard and stopwatch. Sarah could see other instructors positioned along the route, noting which recruits were struggling, which ones were performing well, and which ones were already showing signs of quitting. 28:15, Hoffman called out as Sarah crossed the finish line. She slowed to a walk, her breathing elevated but controlled, sweat beading on her forehead but not the exhausted, gasping condition she saw in some of the other recruits who'd finished ahead of her. "Not bad, Martinez," Hoffman said as she walked past him to the designated cool-down area. His voice was neutral, professional, but she thought she detected just a hint of surprise. Sarah nodded acknowledgement and began her cool-down routine, stretching her leg muscles and monitoring her breathing as she watched the rest of the recruits struggle toward the finish line. Torres finished about 30 seconds behind her, still looking strong. Several other recruits crossed within the 32-minute requirement, their faces showing the strain but their determination intact. Then came the stragglers. Johnson stumbled across the line at just over 34 minutes, his face beet red, his breathing ragged. He immediately bent over, hands on his knees, looking like he might vomit. Several other recruits finished over the time limit, and Sarah could see Hoffman making notes on his clipboard with each late arrival. "That's it!" Hoffman's voice boomed across the beach. "Time's up! If you're not across that line, you just failed your first test." 3 recruits were still struggling down the beach, perhaps 200 yards from the finish. They kept running, but Sarah could see the defeat in their body language. They knew they'd failed, knew they were already behind before the real training had even begun. "Listen up!" Hoffman commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "This was your wake-up call. Some of you performed adequately. Some of you failed. And some of you—" His eyes swept across the group, lingering for a moment on Sarah. "Might have what it takes to be here." He paused, letting his words sink in. But this was the easy part. The real training starts tomorrow. Chow is at 0600, formation at 700. Get some rest, because you're going to need it. As the recruits began to disperse back toward the barracks, Sarah found herself walking alongside Torres and a few others who'd performed well on the run. The conversation was subdued, everyone processing what they'd just experienced and what lay ahead. "Good run out there," Torres said quietly. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" "Texas," Sarah replied simply. "Been running since I was a kid." "Well, you made some people look pretty foolish out there." Torres glanced back toward Johnson, who was still struggling to catch his breath. "That's going to make things interesting." Sarah knew he was right. She'd proven she could keep up physically, but in doing so, she'd also made herself a target. The doubters would work harder to prove she didn't belong, and the instructors would watch her even more closely for any sign of weakness. But as they approached the barracks, and Sarah saw that brass bell mounted near the entrance, she felt her resolve strengthen. She'd survived the first test, and she'd do whatever it took to survive all the others. This was her dream, her calling, her purpose, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A new day was beginning, and with it, the next chapter of the most challenging journey of her life. Sarah Martinez had taken her first steps toward becoming a Navy SEAL, and despite the doubt, despite the skepticism, despite the mountain of challenges ahead, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks into training, the initial group of 78 recruits had already shrunk to 51. The brass bell had claimed its victims with ruthless efficiency, each ring echoing across the compound like a funeral dirge. Sarah had watched young men who looked like they could bench press a small car breakdown, sobbing as they carried their helmets to that bell, their dreams shattered against the unforgiving reality of SEAL training. But Sarah was still here. She'd survived the endless push-ups, the punishing runs, the obstacle courses designed to test every limit of human endurance. More importantly, she'd begun to earn a grudging respect from some of her fellow recruits. Not all of them. Johnson and his circle of supporters still made their displeasure known at every opportunity, but enough that she no longer felt completely isolated. The morning started like all the others, 0500 Reveille, followed by immediate muster in the courtyard. Instructor Hoffman stood before them in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath visible in the cool air, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Today we begin surf passage," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent formation. "For those of you who don't know what that means, you're about to find out. Fall out in dive gear, full wetsuits, fins, masks. You have 10 minutes. Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd heard stories about surf passage from other Navy personnel, whispered tales of recruits being tumbled through crushing waves until they didn't know which way was up. The Pacific Ocean off the California coast was unforgiving even on calm days, and today she could hear the waves crashing against the shore with unusual violence. In the equipment room, Sarah pulled on her wetsuit with practiced efficiency. The thick neoprene was designed to provide some protection against the cold water, but she knew from experience that "some" was a relative term when it came to the Pacific in winter. Around her, other recruits were struggling with their gear, nerves making their fingers clumsy. "You scared, Princess?" Johnson's voice cut through the equipment room chatter. He was standing near his locker, his wetsuit half on, that familiar sneer on his face. "Should I be?" Sarah replied, not looking up from adjusting her fins. "Damn right you should be." Johnson stepped closer, lowering his voice so the instructors couldn't hear. "That water out there will eat you alive. It's not some swimming pool back in whatever backwater town you crawled out of." Sarah straightened up, her mask and fins in hand. "Thanks for the warning, Johnson. I'll be sure to think of you when I'm floating safely in the surf while you're ringing that bell." A few nearby recruits chuckled, and Johnson's face flushed red. "We'll see about that, bitch." The word hung in the air like a slap, and the equipment room went dead quiet. Every recruit within earshot turned to stare, waiting to see how Sarah would respond. She felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same rage that had gotten her into fights back home when boys twice her size had underestimated her. But she also heard her grandfather's voice, calm and steady. "A smart fighter picks their battles, Sarah. Make sure the ground is right before you make your stand. Formation outside, now!" Hoffman's voice boomed from the doorway, and the moment passed. But as the recruits filed out, Sarah caught Johnson's eye and held it for a long second. The message was clear. This wasn't over. The beach looked like a war zone. Waves crashed against the shore with tremendous force, sending spray 30 feet into the air. The instructors had set up a series of inflatable boats just beyond the surf zone, and Sarah could see what the exercise entailed. The recruits would have to swim out through the violent surf, reach the boats, and then somehow make it back to shore in one piece. "Listen up," Hoffman's voice carried over the sound of crashing waves. "Surf Passage is designed to test your watermanship, your ability to think under pressure, and your will to survive when Mother Nature is trying to kill you. You will swim out to those boats, touch the hull, and swim back. Anyone who needs assistance will be disqualified from this evolution." He paused, scanning the group of recruits huddled on the beach in their wetsuits. "The water temperature is 54 degrees. The waves are running 8 to 10 feet with occasional 12-footers. If you have any doubt about your swimming ability, ring out now and save us all some time." No one moved. "Outstanding." Hoffman's smile was predatory. "First group in the water, now!" Sarah found herself in the third group, which meant she had the dubious privilege of watching the first two groups get absolutely demolished by the surf. The first recruit to enter the water was a powerfully built former college swimmer named Davidson. He looked confident as he waded into the shallows, but confidence meant nothing to the Pacific Ocean. The first wave that hit him was only about 6 feet, but it caught him at exactly the wrong angle. Sarah watched as Davidson disappeared completely, swallowed by thousands of pounds of green water. He surfaced 15 seconds later, 20 feet closer to shore than where he'd started, coughing up seawater and looking considerably less confident. "Move! Move! Move!" the instructors shouted from the beach. "The ocean doesn't wait for you to get your bearings." Davidson tried again, timing his entry between sets of waves. This time, he made it past the first line of breakers, but the second wave was larger, and Sarah could see him struggling against the undertow that threatened to drag him back toward shore. He fought through it, stroking powerfully toward the boats, but she could see the effort was already taking its toll. One by one, the first group made their attempts. Some succeeded in reaching the boats, others were defeated by the surf and had to be pulled from the water by safety swimmers. 2 recruits were so badly tumbled by the waves that they emerged from the water disoriented and bleeding from scrapes against the sandy bottom. The second group fared no better. Johnson was in this group, and Sarah watched with interest as he approached the waterline. For all his bluster, she could see the uncertainty in his movements. He'd grown up in Kansas, she'd learned, about as far from the ocean as it was possible to get in the continental United States. Johnson's first attempt was a disaster. He tried to power through the first wave instead of diving under it, and the water picked him up like a toy and hurled him back onto the beach. He came up sputtering, sand in his hair, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. "Get back in there, Johnson," Hoffman shouted. "The enemy doesn't give you time to recover from your mistakes." Johnson's second attempt was better. He managed to dive under the first two waves and started making progress toward the boats. But Sarah could see he was fighting the water instead of working with it, wasting energy with poor technique and panic-driven movements. He made it about halfway to the boats before a large wave caught him and sent him tumbling back toward shore. "Group 3, you're up." Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward the waterline. Around her, the other recruits in her group were psyching themselves up, some muttering prayers, others trying to convince themselves they were ready for what was coming. But Sarah felt something different. As she looked out at the violent surf, she didn't feel fear. She felt recognition. She'd grown up swimming in rivers and lakes across Texas, but she'd also spent time with her grandfather on the Gulf Coast, learning to read water conditions, understanding how to use the ocean's power instead of fighting against it. More importantly, she'd spent countless hours during her Navy service diving in conditions much worse than this, working on ship hulls in heavy seas, conducting underwater repairs while waves tried to smash her against steel bulkheads. The water was shockingly cold as she waded in, but she'd expected that. The first wave approached, and instead of trying to fight through it or power over it, Sarah dove early, slipping under the turbulent surface into the calmer water below. She felt the wave pass overhead, a massive wall of energy that would have crushed her if she'd tried to meet it head-on. She surfaced in the trough between waves, took a quick breath, and immediately dove again as the next wave approached. This one was larger, maybe 8 feet, and she had to dive deeper to avoid being caught in its power. The cold water pressed against her wetsuit, and she could feel the current trying to push her back toward shore, but she angled her body and used her fins to maintain forward momentum. By the time she surfaced again, she was past the worst of the surf zone. The boats were still 100 yards away, but the water here was calmer, rolling swells instead of breaking waves. Sarah settled into a strong freestyle stroke, her years of training evident in her smooth technique and efficient breathing pattern. Behind her, she could hear other recruits struggling with the surf. Someone was coughing violently, probably having swallowed a significant amount of seawater. She could hear the instructors shouting encouragement and criticism from the beach, but she blocked it all out and focused on the task at hand. The boats grew larger as she approached, and she could see the instructors manning them, watching each recruit's approach with clinical detachment. When she reached the nearest boat, she slapped the hull hard enough to make a sound the instructors could hear, then immediately turned around to assess the return trip. The swim back was always harder. Fatigue was setting in. The cold was beginning to penetrate her wetsuit. And swimming toward shore meant she had to time her approach to the surf zone perfectly, or risk being tumbled like the recruits she'd watched from the beach. Sarah treaded water for a moment, studying the wave patterns. Ocean waves weren't random. They came in sets, with larger waves followed by smaller ones in predictable patterns. She'd learned this as a child, watching her grandfather read the water like other people read books. A set of large waves passed, and Sarah saw her opportunity. She began swimming hard toward shore, timing her approach to hit the surf zone during the lull between sets. As the water began to shallow and she could feel the pull of the waves, she caught a smaller wave and rode it partway in, using its energy instead of fighting against it. The landing wasn't graceful. Few ever were in surf this size, but she managed to keep her feet under her as the wave deposited her in waist-deep water. From there, she walked up onto the beach, water streaming from her wetsuit, breathing hard but not exhausted. "Time!" Hoffman called out. 12 minutes! 40 seconds! Sarah looked around and realized she was the first from her group to complete the evolution. The other recruits were still in the water, some struggling toward the boats, others fighting their way back through the surf zone. She could see Torres about 50 yards out, making steady progress toward the boats, and a few others who looked like they'd make it back successfully. But as she watched, she saw 2 recruits from her group being pulled from the water by safety swimmers. One was unconscious, overcome by the combination of cold water, exhaustion, and panic. The other was conscious but hypothermic, his lips blue, his body shaking uncontrollably. "Outstanding work, Martinez," one of the assistant instructors said as she walked up the beach. "Clean entry, efficient swim, good judgment on the return. That's how it's supposed to look." Sarah nodded her thanks, but she was watching Hoffman's face. The head instructor was studying her with those penetrating eyes, and she couldn't read his expression. Was he impressed, suspicious, planning some new way to test her? "Martinez," Hoffman called out, "front and center." Sarah jogged over to where Hoffman was standing, coming to attention in front of him. Up close, she could see the years of sun and salt water etched into his weathered face. Could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "That was well done," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear. "But don't think this changes anything. One good evolution doesn't make you a SEAL." "I understand that, Instructor Hoffman," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes focused straight ahead. "Do you?" Hoffman stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Because I've seen this before. Recruit thinks they're hot shit because they excelled at one thing, starts getting cocky, starts thinking the rules don't apply to them. Then they screw up something basic and wash out in spectacular fashion." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "That won't happen, Instructor." "We'll see," Hoffman stepped back. "But I'll tell you this, Martinez. Every instructor here, every recruit in your class, they're all waiting for you to fail. Some of them want you to fail because they think women don't belong in the teams. Others want you to fail because if you succeed, it makes them look bad." He paused, letting that sink in. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Sarah could respond, Torres came jogging up the beach, followed by 2 other recruits from their group. They'd successfully completed the evolution, though all 3 looked significantly more battered than Sarah did. "Good job out there," Torres said quietly as they walked back toward the equipment shed to rinse off their gear. "Thanks," Sarah replied. "You too." "That was some serious watermanship," one of the other recruits, a quiet guy named Wilson, added. "Where'd you learn to swim like that?" "Navy," Sarah said simply, not wanting to go into details. "I've been in the Navy for 6 years," Wilson continued. "Never seen anyone read the water like that. You dive?" "Some," Sarah admitted. The truth was, she'd been a Navy diver before applying for SEAL training, one of the few women who'd been allowed into the program before it was officially open to females. She'd spent 2 years working on ship hulls, underwater construction, and salvage operations in some of the worst conditions the Navy could find. But she didn't advertise that fact, knowing it would only bring more unwanted attention. As they rinsed the salt water from their gear, Sarah noticed Johnson walking up from the beach. He'd eventually made it to the boats and back, but it had taken him over 20 minutes, and he looked like he'd been put through a blender. His wetsuit was torn in 2 places, probably from being scraped along the bottom, and he had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd just been thoroughly humbled. "Rough day out there, Johnson?" Torres asked, not unkindly. Johnson looked over at their group, his gaze settling on Sarah. For a moment, she thought he might say something conciliatory, might acknowledge that maybe he'd underestimated her. Instead, his expression hardened. "Just wait," he said quietly. "This isn't over." That night in the barracks, Sarah lay in her rack staring at the ceiling. The day's events replayed in her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was building. Hoffman's words echoed in her head. Everyone was waiting for her to fail. She'd known this would be the case when she'd first submitted her application. Being the first woman in SEAL training meant she wasn't just representing herself, she was representing every woman who might follow in her footsteps. The pressure was enormous, and she could feel it weighing on her shoulders like a heavy pack on a long march. But as she lay there listening to the sounds of 50 recruits trying to recover from another brutal day of training, Sarah thought about her grandfather's words. You bend and then snap back harder than before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new ways for people to try to tear her down. But she'd survived the first real test, and she'd done it with style. The brass bell was still there by the entrance, waiting for the next recruit who couldn't take any more. But Sarah Martinez wasn't going anywhere. She had too much to prove. Too many people counting on her, and too much fire burning inside her to quit now. She closed her eyes and tried to get some sleep, knowing that tomorrow would be even harder than today. But for the first time since she'd arrived at the training center, she allowed herself a small smile. She was still here, still fighting, still proving that she belonged. And that was just the beginning. Hell Week arrived like a hurricane making landfall. Sarah had heard the stories, read the accounts, tried to mentally prepare herself for what was coming. But nothing could truly prepare someone for 5.5 days of continuous training with a total of maybe 4 hours of sleep, designed to break the human spirit and separate those with true warrior hearts from those who merely thought they wanted to be Navy SEALs. By Sunday night, the original class of 78 had been reduced to 31 recruits. The brass bell had claimed 47 victims, each ring echoing across the compound like a death knell. Sarah had watched strong men crumble under the relentless pressure, their dreams washing away like sandcastles at high tide. But she was still here. 5 weeks of training had transformed her body into something harder, leaner, more efficient. Her hands were permanently calloused from rope work and obstacle courses. Her shoulders had broadened from countless hours of log PT and boat carries. Most importantly, her mind had developed the kind of steel trap focus that could function even when her body was screaming for mercy. The Hell Week cadre was different from the regular instructors. These were the boogeyman of Bud S., legendary figures whose mere presence could make grown men question their life choices. Chief Petty Officer Marcus the Hammer. Hamilton stood 6'4" and had arms like tree trunks. Petty Officer First Class Dave Nightmare. Rodriguez had eyes like a shark and a voice that could strip paint. And leading them all was Senior Chief Petty Officer William the Destroyer Thompson, a man whose reputation for breaking recruits was matched only by his ability to forge the survivors into weapons. Welcome to Hell Week, children, Thompson's voice carried across the compound in the pre-dawn darkness. For the next 5.5 days, you belong to us completely. You will not sleep. You will not rest. You will discover what you're truly made of. Sarah stood at attention in the formation. Her body already exhausted from the previous week's training, knowing that exhaustion was just the starting point for what was coming. Around her, she could feel the tension radiating from her fellow recruits like heat from a fire. Some of you think you're tough, Thompson continued, his gaze sweeping across the formation. Some of you think you're special. Some of you think that just because you've made it this far, you've got what it takes to be a Navy SEAL. His eyes found Sarah in the formation and held her gaze for a long moment. But I'm here to tell you that everything you've done up to this point has been a warm-up, a gentle introduction to what real training looks like. Starting right now, we're going to find out who has the heart of a warrior and who's just been pretending. The next 6 hours were a blur of punishment, designed to test every aspect of human endurance. Log PT with telephone poles that weighed 300 pounds. Boat carries with inflatable rafts that seemed to get heavier with each step. surf torture, where recruits were forced to sit in the freezing Pacific surf until their core body temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Through it all, Sarah kept her mouth shut and did the work. When Rodriguez screamed in her face about being a weak little girl who didn't belong there, she stared straight ahead and kept lifting that log. When Hamilton forced her team to do endless burpees in the sand, while he questioned her commitment and her sanity, she counted out each repetition with perfect military bearing. But it was during the boat races that everything changed. The boats were heavy inflatable rafts that required 7-person crews to carry and paddle. Sarah found herself assigned to Boat Crew 3, along with Torres, Wilson, and 4 other recruits, including, unfortunately, Johnson. The tension between Sarah and Johnson had been building for weeks, and the stress of Hell Week was bringing it to a breaking point. "Listen up, 3!" Hamilton shouted as their crew struggled to lift their boat overhead for another beach run. "You're moving like old women. My grandmother could carry that boat faster, and she's been dead for 10 years. The crew staggered down the beach with the boat over their heads, sand flying from their boots, the weight of the raft making their shoulders scream in protest. Sarah was positioned at the front right, carrying her share of the weight while trying to maintain pace with the rest of the crew. "Move it, Martinez!" Johnson's voice came from behind her, strained with effort but still carrying that familiar edge of hostility. "Stop holding us back!" Sarah bit back her response and focused on the task. The truth was, she wasn't holding anyone back. If anything, her steady pace and endurance were keeping the crew together when other members started to falter. But Johnson had been looking for any excuse to blame their crew's struggles on her presence. The breaking point came during the paddle races. After carrying the boats to the water, the crews had to paddle out around a series of buoys and back to shore. The Pacific was rough, with 8-foot swells and a stiff offshore wind that made controlling the heavy rafts a nightmare. It was exactly the kind of conditions where teamwork and water skills mattered more than raw physical strength. Boat Crew 3's raft hit the water hard, and immediately Sarah could feel that something was wrong with their coordination. Johnson was calling out paddle commands from his position as boat captain, but his timing was off, and his inexperience in rough water was showing. "Left side, dig! Right side, hold!" Johnson shouted over the sound of wind and waves. But Sarah could see that his command would take them directly into a breaking wave that would swamp their boat. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "Sometimes you have to ignore the man in charge to save everyone's life." "Belay that!" Sarah called out. "All hands, back paddle, hard!" "Who the hell do you think you're talking to?" Johnson's voice was furious. But Sarah was already putting her words into action, back-paddling furiously to avoid the approaching wave. Torres and Wilson immediately followed her lead, and their section of the boat began to pivot away from danger. The wave passed harmlessly by their port side instead of breaking over the bow and filling their raft with hundreds of gallons of cold seawater. "What the hell, Martinez?" Johnson was screaming now, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "I'm the boat captain! You follow my orders!" "Your orders were going to swamp us," Sarah replied calmly, continuing to paddle as the crew worked around the next buoy. "I'm not going to let this crew fail because you don't know how to read the water." It was the wrong thing to say, even though it was true. Johnson's ego, already bruised by weeks of struggling with the maritime aspects of SEAL training, finally snapped. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled. "You think just because you got lucky on a few evolutions you belong here?" "I think I know how to handle a boat in rough water," Sarah replied, her own temper starting to rise. "And I think if you keep running your mouth instead of paddling, we're going to finish dead last." They were approaching the final turn for home, but instead of focusing on the race, Johnson was consumed with his rage at being contradicted by a woman in front of the other crew members. His next words carried clearly across the water, audible not just to their crew, but to the instructor boat following close behind. "You're nothing but a diversity hire," he shouted. "A political statement. You don't belong here." And everyone knows it. You're only here because the Navy needed a token female to make the headlines." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they hurt her feelings, but because they revealed the depth of hatred and resentment she'd been dealing with for months. Every small victory, every successful evolution, every moment of acceptance she'd earned was dismissed as nothing more than politics and tokenism. But worse than Johnson's words was what happened next. Instead of maintaining his position and paddling, Johnson actually stopped rowing and turned around in the boat to face her directly, his paddle raised like a weapon. The sudden shift in weight distribution and loss of forward momentum caused their raft to slide sideways into a trough between waves, putting them in immediate danger. "Johnson, sit down and paddle," Torres shouted from the front of the boat, recognizing the danger they were in. But Johnson was beyond reason now, his face twisted with months of accumulated resentment and frustration. "I'm tired of pretending this is normal. I'm tired of having to carry dead weight because the politically correct Navy decided that—" He never finished the sentence. The wave that hit them was larger than the others, maybe 10 feet of green water that had been building strength as it approached shore. With Johnson out of position and not paddling, their boat had no momentum to cut through it. Instead, the wave hit them broadside, and 300 gallons of freezing Pacific Ocean poured over the gunwales. In an instant, their boat was swamped and sinking, 7 recruits suddenly fighting for their lives in heavy surf conditions. Sarah felt herself go under, the weight of her gear and the violence of the water disorienting her for a moment. But her diving training kicked in, and she quickly oriented herself and swam for the surface. She broke through expecting to see 7 heads bobbing in the water, but when she counted, she only saw 6. Johnson was missing. "Where's Johnson?" Torres shouted over the sound of the waves. Sarah spun around, scanning the water frantically. Then she saw him, about 20 feet away, floating face down and motionless. The same wave that had swamped their boat had apparently caught him completely off guard, and either the impact or the sudden immersion in cold water had left him unconscious. Without thinking, Sarah began swimming toward him. The waves were still large, and every few seconds she lost sight of Johnson's inert form as swells passed between them. But her stroke was strong and sure, her years of diving experience allowing her to make steady progress even in the chaotic conditions. Behind her, she could hear the instructor boat starting up, its engine roaring to life as the safety crew responded to the emergency. But she knew they were too far away to reach Johnson in time. If he was unconscious and face down in the water, every second counted. Sarah reached Johnson just as another large wave was approaching. Instead of fighting the wave, she dove under it, grabbing Johnson's gear vest and pulling him with her into the calmer water below the turbulent surface. When they surfaced together, she immediately flipped him onto his back and began towing him toward shore. Johnson was completely limp, his face pale, seawater streaming from his mouth and nose. Sarah couldn't tell if he was breathing, but she knew she had to get him to shallow water where she could begin CPR if necessary. She locked her arm across his chest and began swimming with powerful side-stroke kicks, fighting against the waves that wanted to push them both under. "Hold on!" she heard Torres shouting from somewhere behind her. "Safety boat's coming!" But Sarah didn't wait for rescue. Johnson's life was in her hands, and she wasn't about to let him die, not even after everything he'd put her through. She continued swimming toward shore, her legs burning with effort, her lungs working overtime in the cold water. When she finally reached water shallow enough to stand, Sarah immediately began checking Johnson's vital signs. He was breathing, but barely, and his skin had the gray pallor of someone in the early stages of hypothermia. She dragged him up onto the beach and immediately began basic life support procedures, tilting his head back to clear his airway and checking for any obstructions. That's when the safety boat finally reached them. "Step back, recruit!" one of the safety swimmers shouted as he leaped from the boat. "We'll take over!" Sarah moved aside but stayed close as the trained medics took over Johnson's care. Within minutes, they had him on oxygen and were loading him onto the boat for transport to the medical facility. As they prepared to leave, one of the medics looked over at Sarah. "Good work getting him to shore," he said simply. "That tow probably saved his life." As the safety boat roared away toward the medical facility, Sarah found herself standing on the beach with the remnants of Boat Crew 3. Torres, Wilson, and the others were all staring at her with expressions she'd never seen before. It wasn't the grudging acceptance she'd grown used to, or even the respectful acknowledgement of competence she'd occasionally earned. It was something deeper, something that looked like awe. "Holy shit, Martinez," Wilson said quietly. "That was incredible." But Sarah barely heard him. She was looking up the beach toward where the Hell Week instructors were standing, all of them watching her with those same unreadable expressions they always wore. Senior Chief Thompson was writing something on his waterproof notepad, his weathered face giving away nothing. As she walked up the beach toward them, dripping seawater and still breathing hard from the rescue, Sarah prepared herself for whatever was coming next. She'd just saved the life of the man who'd made her existence miserable for 2 months, who'd questioned her right to be there, who'd endangered their entire crew with his prejudice and incompetence. But she'd also violated the sacred chain of command by countermanding a boat captain's orders. She'd broken protocol by initiating a rescue instead of waiting for the safety team. In the rigid hierarchy of military training, those violations could be grounds for dismissal, regardless of the outcome. Senior Chief Thompson looked up from his notepad as she approached, his shark's eyes studying her from head to toe. Around them, the beach had gone quiet, except for the sound of waves and the distant noise of other boat crews continuing their races. "Martinez," Thompson's voice was calm, professional, giving nothing away. "That was quite a performance out there." Sarah came to attention, water still streaming from her gear. "Senior Chief, I can explain." "Explain what?" Thompson interrupted. "Explain how you read those wave conditions better than your boat captain. Explain how you recognize the danger before anyone else. Explain how you executed a textbook water rescue under combat conditions." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. This wasn't the dressing down she'd expected. Thompson stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Let me tell you something, recruit. I've been training SEALs for 23 years. I've seen every type of operator imaginable, the physical specimens, the intellectual prodigies, the natural leaders, the fearless warriors." He paused, studying her face. "But what I just witnessed out there was something special. Not because you're female, not because of any politically correct nonsense, but because you demonstrated the 3 most important qualities of a Navy SEAL." Sarah remained at attention, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. "First, you had the technical competence to recognize a dangerous situation and take appropriate action. Second, you had the moral courage to do what was right even when it meant contradicting authority. And third, you had the warrior's heart to risk your own life to save a teammate, even a teammate who'd treated you like garbage." Thompson stepped back, his voice returning to normal volume so the other instructors could hear. "That, people, is what a Navy SEAL looks like." The words hung in the air like smoke from gunfire. Around the beach, the other instructors were nodding their agreement, their expressions showing a respect that Sarah had never seen directed toward any recruit. "Now," Thompson continued, his voice returning to its normal bark, "get your gear squared away and get ready for the next evolution. Hell Week isn't over just because you had one good moment." As Sarah jogged back toward the equipment area, she could hear conversations starting up behind her. The other recruits were talking about what they'd witnessed, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the training center, the tone wasn't skeptical or dismissive. "Did you see how she read that wave pattern? That was a perfect rescue tow. Textbook technique. She probably saved Johnson's life. But it was Torres who captured what everyone was thinking as he caught up with her near the gear shed. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "For what?" "For doubting you," Torres replied. "We all did, if we're being honest. We thought you were here to prove a point, to break barriers, to make some kind of political statement." He paused, shaking his head. "But watching you out there, you weren't trying to prove anything to anyone. You were just being a SEAL, a real one, the kind they write legends about." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold water or physical exhaustion. For the first time since she'd arrived at the training center, she felt like she truly belonged. Not as a female trying to break into a male domain, not as a symbol or a political statement, but as a warrior among warriors. "Thanks," she said simply, not trusting her voice to say more. As they prepared for the next evolution, Sarah caught sight of the brass bell near the entrance to the compound. 47 recruits had rung that bell, giving up their dreams when the pressure became too much to bear. For months, people had been waiting for her to join them, expecting her to break under the strain of being the first, the different one, the outsider. But she was still here. More than that, she had just demonstrated that she didn't just belong in the Navy SEALs. She exemplified everything the organization stood for: technical competence, moral courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. 3 hours later, word came back from the medical facility that Johnson was going to be fine. He'd suffered mild hypothermia and had taken in some seawater, but there was no permanent damage. The medics confirmed that Sarah's quick action had probably prevented a much more serious outcome. Johnson returned to training the next day, his attitude completely changed. The man who had spent months questioning Sarah's right to be there now treated her with the kind of respect reserved for proven operators. He never directly thanked her for saving his life, but he didn't need to. The change in his behavior spoke louder than words ever could. Hell Week continued for 3 more days, testing every aspect of human endurance and will. Sarah survived it all: the endless PT sessions, the hypothermia-inducing surf torture, the psychological games designed to break the human spirit. She survived because she had already proven to herself and everyone else that she belonged. When Hell Week finally ended, 26 recruits remained from the original class of 78. Sarah Martinez was one of them, but more than that, she had become something none of them had expected when she first stepped off that transport vehicle months earlier. She had become the standard by which all the others measured themselves. The brass bell stood silent now, having claimed its final victims. But for Sarah and the 25 warriors who stood beside her, it was no longer a symbol of failure. It had become a reminder of what they had overcome, of the strength they had found within themselves, of the brotherhood and sisterhood they had forged in the crucible of the world's most demanding military training. Sarah Martinez had started this journey as a woman trying to prove she could be a Navy SEAL. She was ending it as a Navy SEAL who happened to be a woman, and that made all the difference in the world.